The echo of my voice cracking sliced through the sterile boardroom silence like a fault line in glass. Charts blurred on the screen behind me, numbers I'd rehearsed 100 times now, mocking my unraveling poise. The data error glowed red, undeniable, as executive stares pinned me in place. Years of meticulously built composure, sharp suits, measured breaths, the armor that had carried me through mergers and deadlines threatened to shatter, dragging my career and the fragile self-image I'd clung to into the abyss. As the meeting dispersed in murmurs, isolation wrapped around me tighter, amplifying the internal storm raging just beneath my skin. Every morning began the same. The sharp click of heels on marble floors, my reflection in the lobby mirrors a study in precision. Tailored blouse buttoned to the collar, hair pulled into a low chignon that betrayed no stray strand. I'd linger there a moment, adjusting the cuff of my sleeve, feeling the familiar weight of the facade settle like a second skin. It masked the deeper ache, the one that had taken root years ago in quieter failures, in nights alone questioning if control was salvation or just another cage. But in this firm, where glass walls overlooked the city's relentless pulse and every deal hinged on unflinching certainty, vulnerability was currency no one traded. The office hummed with that high-stakes rhythm. Analysts hunched over glowing screens, parsing market tremors, partners gliding through corridors, their voices low and commanding, sealing fates with a signature. Control defined worth here, yours or the firm's, and I'd clawed my way up from junior consultant to lead strategist by embodying it. Mornings blurred into strategy sessions, afternoons into client calls where one wrong inflection could unravel alliances built on billions. I thrived on the edge of it, or so I told myself. The adrenaline sharpened focus, buried the longing for something rawer, something that didn't demand I perform perfection at every turn. Lunches were power bars at my desk, evenings stretching late under fluorescent hum. The city lights below a distant promise of lives less armored. That Tuesday, the air in the boardroom carried the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen, the long oak table polished to a mirror sheen reflecting the faces arrayed around it. Senior partners with their leather-bound notepads, the weight of expectations pressing like gravity. I'd prepared for weeks. The pitch for the merger acquisition, slides layered with projections, risks mitigated to decimals. My hands were steady as I launched into it, voice even, guiding them through revenue streams and competitive edges. The room nodded along, pens scratching approval. For a moment, the ache receded, replaced by the thrill of command. Then the slide flipped, and there it was, the data error. A misplaced decimal in the valuation forecast that ballooned the risk assessment by millions. My voice faltered mid-sentence, the crack echoing in the sudden hush. Heads turned, brows furrowed, the silence thickening like fog rolling off the harbor outside. "That's an oversight," I managed, fingers hovering over the remote, but the damage bloomed immediately, whispers rippling, a partner clearing his throat with pointed discomfort. Public scrutiny hit like a cold wave, exposing the raw fragility I'd buried under layers of rehearsal and resolve. My pulse thrummed in my ears, cheeks warming under the collective gaze. I forced a smile, thin and professional, the kind that had saved presentations before. Lips curving just enough to deflect, eyes meeting theirs with feigned assurance. But inside, the jolt reverberated, a seismic shift cracking the foundation. The ache surged, whispering doubts I'd silenced for years. How had I missed it? The question looped, sharp and unrelenting, as questions fired, clarifications laced with skepticism, timelines demanded for corrections. I navigated them, voice steadying by sheer will, but the armor felt thinner, the weight of exposed edges pressing inward. From the head of the table she observed, Eleanor Voss, the CEO, her presence a formidable anchor in the chaos. Mid-40s, with amber eyes that held the room without effort, and a voice like low contralto that cut through boardroom din. She was the firm's unyielding core. Rumors swirled of her rise through hostile takeovers, her reserve a shield as impenetrable as the contracts she signed. She hadn't spoken yet, but her gaze lingered on me, unreadable, a subtle tilt to her head that sent an unfamiliar pull through the tension. Not pity, but something probing, as if she saw the fracture lines I was desperate to seal. The meeting dragged to a close, decisions tabled pending revisions, the partners filing out with clipped nods. I gathered my notes, the remote slipping slightly in my palm, sweat cooling on my skin. Her chair scraped last, the sound deliberate. She paused at the door, briefcase in hand. But her eyes met mine again, brief, charged, before she turned away. The boardroom emptied, leaving me alone with the hum of the projector and the city sprawl beyond the windows. I fled to the adjacent conference room, a smaller space with frosted glass that muffled the world. Sinking into a chair, I pressed palms to my temples, the weight of judgment lingering like smoke. The internal storm no longer contained, but spilling into every shadowed corner of my thoughts. My hands trembled as I pushed away from the table, the faint quiver betraying what the boardroom had extracted. Fingers splayed flat against the cool surface, but they refused to still, the tremor rippling up my arms like aftershocks from the data's betrayal. I rose, drawn to the frosted glass wall that separated this room from the corridor, my reflection fracturing in its etched patterns. A woman with smudged eyeliner, lips pressed thin, the sharp lines of her suit suddenly ill-fitting over the vulnerability it couldn't contain. The cracks stared back, not just in the glass, but in the composure I'd worn like a second skin. Eyes shadowed, jaw tight, the facade splintering under the weight of that single error, revealing the raw edges I'd hidden for so long. What was this prison I'd built, this perpetual poise that demanded I swallow every doubt, every flicker of uncertainty, until they fermented into an ache that gnawed from within? I'd convinced myself it was armor, essential in a world where one slip could topple alliances forged in steel. But now, alone in the dimming light of the conference room, the question clawed free. Had it saved me, or merely isolated me further, turning every interaction into a performance where authenticity was the first casualty? The longing surfaced then, unspoken and insistent, for a space where I could breathe without calculation, where the tremble in my hands might be met not with judgment, but with understanding. Yet the firm offered no such sanctuary, its corridors a labyrinth of expectations that echoed my isolation back at me, amplifying the storm into something vast and consuming. I slipped into the hallway, the office emptying as the day waned. Empty corridors stretched before me, their polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in cold, sterile pools, the silence broken only by the distant hum of elevators and the faint click of a door latching somewhere far off. My footsteps echoed too loudly, each one carrying the weight of unspoken longings. The desire to be seen beyond the strategist, the woman who orchestrated deals with unflinching precision. Heels sinking into the carpet, I paused at a window overlooking the harbor, the water churning gray under gathering clouds, mirroring the turmoil I couldn't voice. Colleagues had vanished into their private lives, leaving me adrift in this vast space, the isolation pressing like a physical thing, stirring memories of quieter failures, of nights where the ache had bloomed unchecked, whispering that control was illusion, poise a costly lie. The intercom on the wall buzzed then, sharp and unexpected, jolting me from the reverie. I froze, hand hovering. The voice that followed low and measured, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Eleanor Voss, summoning me to her office with a simple directive, no explanation offered. My breath caught, the subtle pursuit unnerving in its directness. Why me? Now? When the vulnerability still hummed fresh. Heart quickening, I smoothed my blouse, the fabric suddenly too confining, and made my way down the hall, past the executive suites with their half-drawn blinds, the anticipation building with each step, a mix of fear that she'd dissect the error further, and an unfamiliar pull, magnetic and disquieting, drawing me toward her domain. Rising unease coiled in my chest as I approached her door, the polished wood a barrier that promised both judgment and something deeper, unnameable. The handle turned cool under my palm, and as it opened, the charged space awaited. Her office, a sanctuary of dark leather and floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawl beyond framing her silhouette, amber eyes turning to meet mine with that same probing intensity, the air thick with the weight of what was yet to unfold. Her presence filled the office like a low-frequency hum, the unreadable gaze locking onto mine from behind the expansive desk, amber eyes steady and assessing, as if she could map the fault lines of my composure without a single word. The low voice that followed cut through the tension with effortless precision, a contralto rich and measured, wrapping around the silence like velvet over steel. "Close the door behind you," she said, the directive simple yet weighted, pulling me deeper into the space where the air carried hints of polished leather and the faint, grounding scent of aged books lining the shelves. I complied, the click of the latch echoing softly, sealing us in this private realm high above the city's indifferent churn, where the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the harbor's restless gray, waves lapping against the pilings far below like unspoken regrets. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking faintly under her form, fingers steepled before her as she regarded me. Not with the sharp critique I'd braced for, but with a quiet intensity that unraveled something deeper, stirring the ache I'd buried under layers of professional gloss. The power dynamic hung between us, tangible as the oak desk that served as both barrier and invitation, its surface a vast expanse of burnished wood scattered with contracts, and a single crystal decanter, the space humming electric despite the distance. She was the firm's unyielding axis, her decisions rippling through every corridor, every deal, while I stood on the periphery, the strategist whose one lapse had exposed the fragility beneath my armor. Yet proximity bridged it all, the room contracting around us, her silhouette sharp against the window's glow, drawing me forward with an inexplicable pull that made the air feel charged, particles aligning in the space between. I shifted on my feet, the carpet muffling my heels, attempting to summon the composure that had always been my refuge, the straight-backed posture, the measured nod that signaled readiness for whatever scrutiny awaited. About the presentation, I began, voice steady by force of habit, though it carried the faint edge of defense, a shield against the probing that seemed to emanate from her very stillness. But she tilted her head slightly, a gesture both dismissive and engaging, her low voice interjecting before I could build my case. "The numbers can wait. Sit, if you like." No, that wasn't it. Her words lingered on the air, but it was the sultry observation that followed, delivered with a subtle curve to her lips that pierced the armor I'd hastily reforged. There's a certain beauty in restrained intensity, you know, the way it simmers just beneath the surface, threatening to break free. Yours cracked today, and it was compelling. The compliment landed like a spark on dry tinder, warm and disorienting, her gaze holding mine with an unhurried depth that mapped the vulnerability I'd tried to conceal. Amber depths reflecting not judgment, but a shared recognition of the masks we wore. I felt exposed under it, the defense crumbling as I met her eyes, my attempted composure fracturing further. Words faltered on my tongue, a flush creeping up my neck despite the cool draft from the vents overhead. I meant to handle it better, I murmured, the admission slipping out unbidden, my fingers twisting the edge of my sleeve as if to anchor myself against the gentle probing that followed. Her questions not accusatory but layered, peeling back the professional veneer with a precision that mirrored her boardroom command. What happened in there wasn't just a decimal shift. It was a release, wasn't it? The weight of holding it all in. The sensory anchor of her watch ticked steadily from her wrist, a rhythmic underscore to the fleeting control I clung to, each second marking the erosion of my defenses in this intimate space. The sound blended with the distant murmur of the city below, a metronome to the tension coiling between us, reminding me how precarious the balance was, how one unguarded moment could tip everything into uncharted territory. She rose then, rounding the desk with a grace that belied her authority, the proximity closing the gap to mere feet, the electric hum intensifying as her presence loomed not threatening, but enveloping. The faint warmth of her nearness stirring the ache into something sharper, more insistent. I held my ground, breath shallow, the probing gentle, yet relentless, her voice dropping lower, inviting truths I hadn't voiced even to myself. Tell me, what does it cost you? This poise you carry so well. The question hung, heavy with implication, her unreadable gaze softening just enough to reveal the guardedness beneath her own reserve, a mutual vulnerability flickering in the charged air. My defense wavered, words forming haltingly as the watch's tick echoed the pulse in my temples, underscoring how control slipped away in her orbit. She gestured toward the leather armchair opposite her desk, the invitation extending the intimate interrogation, a subtle command wrapped in courtesy that drew me closer to the edge of revelation, the office's shadows lengthening as the afternoon light waned, promising depths yet unexplored. I sank into the leather armchair, the material yielding with a soft sigh that seemed to echo the surrender building within me. The desk now a scant divide between us, its surface catching the fading light in polished gleams. Her insight came unhurried, delivered in that low contralto that resonated like a tuning fork against my fraying nerves. She named the cost of the emotional armor I'd worn too long, her words peeling back the layers with surgical gentleness. That poise you carry, it's a fortress, isn't it? Built brick by brick to weather the storms of this world. But fortresses demand tribute. They starve the spirit inside, turning every genuine impulse into a shadow, every connection into a calculated risk. How long have you paid that toll, holding back the parts of yourself that ache to be free? The shared glance that followed held us suspended, her amber eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stripped away pretenses, revealing the mutual guardedness we both harbored, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers paused mid-gesture, betraying the reserves she maintained as rigorously as I did mine. In that moment, the space between us felt charged, a palpable current humming with unspoken parallels. She, the CEO who navigated boardrooms like battlefields, her authority a veil over vulnerabilities carved by years of ascent. And me, the strategist, whose failures echoed her own hidden fractures. The office's quiet amplified it, the distant honk of traffic below a faint underscore to the vulnerability threading through her gaze, inviting me to see the woman behind the title, the one who understood the isolation of command as intimately as the terror of collapse. Workplace shadows crept into the conversation then, her words coded with hints at the industry's risks for authenticity, the subtle biases woven into client dinners and performance reviews, where a slip of emotion could be twisted into weakness, especially for those like us, navigating the undercurrents of concealed identities in a realm that prized conformity above all. This firm, this city, it's a machine that rewards the mask, she murmured, her voice dropping to a near whisper, eyes flicking to the window where the harbor churned restlessly. Show too much of yourself, and the gears grind slower. The deals falter, the promotions stall. I've seen it claim careers, turn allies into spectators. But authenticity? It's the quiet rebellion, the fire that sustains when the facade crumbles. Her phrasing carried the weight of experience, veiled references to whispered rumors of her own guarded life, the risks amplified for women who dared to blur the lines of power and desire in spaces designed to keep them separate. The confessions slipped from me then, whispered in the heavy silence, my voice barely rising above the steady tick of her watch. I admitted the hidden vulnerabilities I'd buried under years of precision. The late nights replaying minor slights until they festered into doubt. The longing for connections that didn't demand I perform invincibility. The ache of identities sidelined in pursuit of advancement. It's exhausting, I breathed, the words tumbling out like stones dislodged from a dam. Pretending the cracks aren't there, that the weight doesn't pull me under some days. I've hidden so much, parts of me that don't fit the strategist mold, desires that could unravel everything if they surfaced. My hands clasped in my lap, knuckles whitening, but her nod was subtle encouragement, the amber in her eyes warming with recognition, drawing the admission forth like a tide. A subtle compliment followed, her praise for the fire beneath my surface calm delivered with a sultry undertone that sent a shiver through the charged air. And yet, there's a fire in you, banked but fierce. It's what makes your strategies sing, what drew every eye in that room today, even in the fracture. Not everyone has that. It's rare, indelible, the kind of intensity that reshapes rooms without a word. Her voice lingered on the words, low and resonant, the compliment wrapping around me like a touch, affirming the hidden strength I doubted, her gaze holding mine with an appreciation that blurred the lines of authority, stirring the ache into something warmer, more insistent. The proximity of the desk felt illusory now, the barrier dissolving in the wake of her words, leaving only the electric hum between us. Vulnerabilities shared like secrets in the dimming light. Outside, evening rain began to patter against the windows, soft at first, then building to a steady rhythm that mirrored the brewing internal tempest, the drops streaking the glass in erratic paths, blurring the city lights into hazy auras, as if the storm within me had found its echo in the world beyond, promising turbulence yet to crest. The rain's rhythm against the windows grew insistent, a steady percussion that underscored the extended dialogue unfolding between us, her voice weaving stories of past failures that had forged her own walls. Each revelation a deliberate unlayering of the reserve she wore like a tailored suit. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the desk's edge, the amber in her eyes catching the dimming light as she spoke of her early days in the firm. A hostile takeover she'd led at 32, where a single emotional lapse during negotiations had nearly cost her the deal. The board's sidelong glances turning her vulnerability into a weapon they wielded in whispers for years. "I learned then," she murmured, her contralto dropping to a resonant timbre that filled the space, that walls aren't built overnight. They're erected in the aftermath of fractures. Each one a reminder that exposure invites not just connection, but predation. Mine rose highest after that, nights replaying the moment, questioning if the ascent was worth the isolation it demanded. I listened, the words resonating with my own buried echoes, the ache in my chest mirroring the storm's swell outside. Her narrative pulled at the threads of my composure, inviting parallels I hadn't voiced, the shared weight of professional scars binding us in this shadowed office. She paused, gaze steady on mine, the silence stretching heavy and charged, before continuing with a quieter confession. A mentor's betrayal, veiled as guidance, that had taught her the perils of trust in a realm where power imbalances hummed like latent threats. "Failures like those," she said, her fingers tracing an invisible line on the desk, "they carve out spaces, we fill with control. But they leave hollows, too. Places where desires linger unspoken, waiting for a crack to surface. The sultry edge to her observation lingered, not overt, but woven into the cadence, affirming the fire she'd praised earlier. Her words a gentle probe that mapped the contours of my own guarded longings without demanding their full exposure. Physical nearness bridged the divide then, as my hand trembled on the armrest, unbidden, the aftershock of the day's unraveling surfacing in the intimacy of her presence. And she reached across, her fingers closing over mine in a steadying gesture, warm and unyielding, the contact sending a jolt through me that lingered like the rain's patter on glass. The warmth seeped into my skin, grounding the tremor, her touch lingering a beat longer than necessity dictated, the subtle pressure conveying a reassurance that blurred the lines of authority, stirring the electric hum between us into something sharper, more insistent. I didn't pull away, the proximity enveloping, her palm calloused faintly from years of signing fates, now anchoring mine in this moment of quiet revelation. The desk's barrier felt distant, the office contracting around the point of contact, where unspoken desires began their slow cartography, tracing paths of vulnerability I'd long suppressed. Emotional cartography unfolded in the wake of that touch, her voice guiding us through the ache of those unspoken desires, mapping the terrain with a precision that mirrored her strategic mind, the longing for authenticity in a world that tokenized it, the isolation amplified by desires that defied the firm's unspoken codes. It's like charting unknown waters, she continued, her hand withdrawing slowly, the absence leaving a faint warmth that echoed in my pulse, where every current pulls toward revelation, but the undertows of expectation drag you back. What desires have you mapped in secret? The ones that ache beneath the strategist's calm. Her question hung, sultry in its intimacy, inviting me to trace my own lines, the hidden facets of identity sidelined for advancement, the pull toward connections that promise depth over transaction, without forcing the full confession. The words a sanctuary amid the corporate cage that enclosed us both. Microaggressions recalled surfaced then, her tone shifting to recall the firm's subtle biases that amplified isolation, the offhand comments in client meetings about family values that masked exclusion, the promotions that favored the overtly assertive while sidelining those who navigated quieter strengths, especially women whose authenticity carried added risks in veiled discussions of loyalty and fit. I've heard the whispers, she said, eyes narrowing slightly, the amber darkening with remembered frustration. The way a pause in conversation turns pointed when someone dares a personal truth. The isolation it breeds, like frost on glass. It forges us tighter into ourselves, but at what cost? The ache of being unseen? The desires we bury to survive the cage? Her words evoked my own encounters, the subtle exclusions in team retreats, the weight of concealed identities pressing like an invisible hand, amplifying the storm within. In her recounting, I saw the parallels, the shared navigation of those undercurrents that made every interaction a delicate balance. The realization dawned gradually, her words emerging as sanctuary amid the corporate cage, a refuge where the ache could breathe without judgment, the office's walls no longer confining but containing this fragile exchange. In her presence, the isolation fractured, replaced by a mutual recognition that eased the perpetual tension I'd carried, her insights a balm that affirmed the fire beneath my calm, without demanding its full blaze. The late hour deepened then, shadows lengthening across the leather and oak, the rain a ceaseless murmur outside, drawing the intimacy of the office into sharper relief, the charged space between us promising revelations yet to crest in the gathering dusk. The shadows in her office thickened as the rain intensified, a relentless sheet against the windows that blurred the city into abstract smears of light and motion, mirroring the haze settling over my thoughts in the wake of her revelations. She shifted in her chair, the leather sighing softly, and for the first time, a fracture appeared in her reserve. A brief glimpse into the personal losses that had shaped it, delivered in a voice that softened at the edges, losing some of its contralto command. "Reserve isn't chosen lightly," she murmured, her amber eyes drifting to the harbor's distant churn, where waves collided in ceaseless unrest. "Mine was forged in silences that followed a divorce no one at the firm ever knew about, the kind where trust eroded not in boardrooms, but in the quiet betrayals of shared beds and whispered promises." She left, taking pieces of me I hadn't realized were vulnerable, leaving walls that rose instinctively, higher with each promotion, each deal that demanded I bury the ache deeper. Losses like that teach you the cost of openness. They turn desire into a risk you calculate like any merger, weighing the potential fallout against the isolation of solitude. Her words hung in the dimming space, a confession veiled yet raw, revealing the woman behind the CEO's unyielding facade, the one who had navigated not just corporate predators, but the intimate wounds that lingered like unseen fractures, shaping her guardedness into something both protective and profoundly lonely. I felt the pull of it, the mutual ache resonating in my chest, her vulnerability a mirror to my own, inviting a reciprocity that blurred the lines of authority. In that moment, the office felt less like a cage and more like a confessional. The rain's patter, a curtain sealing us from the world's judgments, allowing these glimpses to surface without the peril of exposure. Then came the touch escalation, subtle yet deliberate. My wrist rested on the desk's edge, pulse visible beneath the skin, and her fingers brushed it in passing, a fleeting contact as she reached for a forgotten pen. But it lingered, sending a sharp electric jolt up my arm that arched through my core like a live wire igniting dormant circuits. The warmth of her skin against mine was grounding and incendiary, the faint callus on her fingertip tracing an unintentional path that heightened every nerve, the proximity amplifying the magnetic draw until the air between us thrummed with unspoken tension. I didn't withdraw, the jolt echoing in my veins, stirring the internal conflict that warred within. The pull between professional boundaries, ironclad and essential in this firm where power imbalances could unravel careers, and the insistent draw of her presence, a force that tugged at the edges of my resolve, whispering of connections that defied the rules we'd both internalized. Her sultry affirmation followed, voice dropping to a husky timbre that wrapped around the silence like smoke, affirming the hidden strength I'd glimpsed in myself only through her lens. That strength in you, the one that surfaced today amid the fracture, it's not hidden, not to those who look closely. It's a quiet force, resilient and profound, the kind that reshapes not just deals, but the very spaces it occupies, drawing others into its orbit without apology. The words caressed, low and resonant, her gaze holding mine with an intensity that affirmed without overwhelming. The compliment a balm to the vulnerabilities we'd both aired. Yet it deepened the conflict, the magnetic pull intensifying as boundaries blurred in the charged air. Professional decorum clashing with the ache for something authentic, uncalculated. Our breaths synced in the heavy, charged silence that followed, the rhythm aligning unconsciously, mine shallow and quick, hers steady and deep, creating a cadence that underscored the intimacy, the rain's murmur fading to a distant hum as the world narrowed to this shared respiration, a sensory recurrence that bound us in the office's shadowed sanctuary. The pull grew insistent, the internal storm raging between restraint and revelation, her presence a lodestone I couldn't ignore. Yet the late hour pressed, reality intruding with the soft chime of the elevator summoning from the hall, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. She rose first, the movement graceful, breaking the sync with a subtle nod toward the door. "We should end this for tonight," she said, voice regaining its measured tone, though the amber in her eyes lingered with promise. I followed, the departure drawing us into the corridor's cooler air, the elevator doors sliding open with a whisper, confining us further in the mirrored box that descended slowly, reflections multiplying the space between us into infinite layers of tension yet to resolve. The elevator's mirrored walls enclosed us in a silvered cage, reflections multiplying endlessly, our silhouettes intertwined in infinite regression, her form a steady anchor beside mine, the subtle curve of her shoulder echoing in every pain, while my own posture, still laced with the day's tension, fragmented into wary angles that betrayed the storm simmering beneath. The descent hummed softly, floors ticking away in illuminated numbers, but time stretched languidly in that confined space, the air growing thicker with the faint scent of rain-dampened wool from her coat and the lingering trace of her perfume, something woody and understated that wrapped around the charged silence like an unspoken invitation. Proximity sharpened everything. Her arm brushed mine as the car swayed slightly, a fleeting contact that sent awareness prickling along my skin. The warmth of her presence stirring an unfamiliar longing, simmering low and insistent, pulling at the edges of the resolve I'd rebuilt in fragments during our exchange above. She broke the quiet first, her murmur echoing the compliment from her office, voice low and resonant in the intimate confines, carrying that sultry undertone that made the words linger like a caress. The allure of cracking composure. It's intoxicating, isn't it? Yours today wasn't a failure. It was a revelation. The kind that draws the eye, makes one wonder what else lies just beyond the surface, waiting to be unveiled. The echo of her praise wrapped around me, affirming the vulnerability I'd exposed, her amber eyes meeting mine in the mirror's reflection, holding with an intensity that blurred the professional divide, stirring the ache into something warmer, more insistent, as if she saw not just the strategist, but the woman yearning for depths uncharted in this firm where every glance carried calculation. Heightened awareness bloomed in the descent's slow pull, her proximity a magnetic field that heightened every sense, the faint rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine again, the subtle shift of her weight as the elevator steadied, brushing her hip against my side in the narrow space, igniting a simmer of longing I'd never allowed to surface in these sterile halls. It was unfamiliar, this pull, a quiet fire uncoiling in my chest, drawing me toward her orbit despite the barriers of rank and restraint. The mirrored walls amplified it, our reflections layering intimacy upon intimacy, her profile sharp and composed yet softened in the dim glow, inviting me to trace the lines of her jaw, the way her lips curved faintly, as if the same awareness hummed through her, unspoken but palpable in the electric space between. LGBTQ+ undercurrents, threaded into the conversation then, veiled and careful, her voice dropping to navigate the concealed identities that shadowed our world at work. The subtle codes we both employed to sideline desires that could fracture alliances or invite scrutiny, in a firm where authenticity often meant navigating minefields of assumption and exclusion. "This place demands we conceal so much," she said softly, eyes flicking to our multiplied reflections. "The parts of ourselves that don't align with the expected narrative, the desires that simmer in silence, the identities we guard like trade secrets, lest they become leverage in the wrong hands. I've learned to veil mine, to let them surface only in shadows, away from the boardroom's unforgiving light. It's a survival, but it carves hollows where connection should thrive." Her words carried the weight of shared navigation, the risks amplified for women like us, where a hinted affection could twist into rumor, stalling a sense built on perceived neutrality. The emotional turn came as the elevator neared the lobby, her gaze steadying on mine directly now, an admission of mutual recognition in those veiled struggles slipping forth like a quiet exhale. I see it in you, the same guarded dance, the way you hold back not from weakness, but from knowing the cost of revelation in spaces that don't make room for it. We're mirrors in that, aren't we? Recognizing the pull of what we've concealed, the longing for someone who understands without demanding the full unmasking. The confession bound us closer in the descending box, her words a bridge over the isolation we'd both mapped, the simmering longing cresting into something profound, a shared vulnerability that eased the ache without resolving it. Her presence a sanctuary amid the firm's unyielding expectations. The doors parted with a chime, spilling us into the rain-soaked exit, the lobby's marble floors slick underfoot, water sheeting from the revolving doors in relentless waves that heightened the raw, exposed connection between us. The storm outside mirroring the tempest within, droplets catching in her hair like scattered diamonds, her hand grazing my elbow in steadying guidance as we stepped into the downpour, the contact lingering, promising depths yet to unfold in the night's uncharted embrace. The rain lashed sideways as we crossed the lobby's threshold, umbrellas forgotten in the haste of departure, the downpour soaking through my coat in seconds, cold rivulets tracing paths down my neck that mirrored the vulnerability still uncoiling from our elevator descent. She led the way without a word, her stride purposeful through the revolving doors and into the adjacent parking garage. The structure a dimly lit cavern of concrete pillars and echoing drips, fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead in sparse pools of yellow that cast long shadows across the slick floors. Vulnerability stretched between us like those shadows, elongated and raw under the low ceiling. The storm's roar muffled here to a distant thunder that amplified the intimacy of our shared shelter. Puddles reflected the fractured light, mirroring the cracks in my composure that her presence continued to probe. Each step echoing the pull I'd felt since her office, now heightened in this enclosed space where the city's indifference faded to a hum. We paused near her car, a sleek black sedan gleaming wetly under a flickering light, the air thick with the metallic tang of rain on asphalt and the faint ozone of the garage's ventilation. Her silhouette loomed against the concrete wall, water beading on her lashes as she turned to me. And then came the climactic gaze, our eyes locking with an intensity that stripped away the final layers of restraint, amber depths meeting mine in unyielding clarity. The world narrowing to that connection where professional masks dissolved entirely. In her stare, I saw the full measure of what we'd skirted all evening. The mutual recognition of desires long guarded, the ache of isolation yielding to something profound and terrifying. No words passed, but the gaze held us captive, her expression softening from command to a vulnerable openness that invited my own surrender, the shadows playing across her features like confessions, etched in light and dark. She broke the silence first, her voice a low murmur that cut through the drip of water from overhead pipes, carrying the weight of a warning wrapped in sultry candor. True intimacy demands more than glimpses in boardroom fractures. It requires surrender, beyond these facades we both wear so well, a letting go of the control that has defined us, even when it terrifies. I've paid that cost myself, felt the terror of exposure in spaces where power twists vulnerability into weakness. But the alternative? The endless isolation of poise unbroken. It's a hollow victory, one that starves the very connections we crave most. Her words lingered, resonant and probing, the sultry undertone affirming the fire she'd seen in me earlier, now urging it toward revelation. She stepped closer, the proximity electric in the dim confines, her warning not a barrier, but an invitation to weigh the terror against the promise of authenticity. The rain's patter syncing with my quickening pulse as the shadows deepened around us. The breakthrough came then, unbidden, but inevitable under her gaze. A profound shift where I embraced the terror of authentic exposure, the ache transforming from burden to liberation as I met her eyes without deflection, admitting in silence what words couldn't yet capture. The willingness to risk the firm's unyielding gaze, the concealed desires that had simmered in isolation, now surfacing as strength rather than fracture. It was as if the garage's dim lights illuminated not just concrete, but the contours of my guarded self, the vulnerability no longer a flaw, but a bridge. Her presence grounded it, the mutual guardedness we'd shared evolving into a shared courage, the storm outside paling against the internal tempest yielding to clarity, where poise's cost, years of suppressed longing, paled against the pull of connection unfeigned. Her hand rose then, settling on my shoulder in a final touch that grounded the profound shift, fingers warm through the damp fabric of my coat, the pressure steady and reassuring, lingering with a subtle firmness that sent a quiet jolt through me, anchoring the revelation without overwhelming it. The contact was intimate yet restrained, her palm conveying a silent affirmation of the fire beneath my calm, the touch a promise of sanctuary amid the risks we'd named. In that moment, the electric hum between us peaked, not in consummation but in potential, her thumb brushing lightly once before withdrawing, leaving warmth that echoed long after. Parting words came as she unlocked her car, voice soft against the garage's echo. Think on it, the cost, and what lies beyond. They lingered like the rain's fading roar, promising uncharted emotional terrain as I watched her taillights recede into the night, the shadows swallowing her form, my steps toward my own vehicle carrying the weight of possibilities yet to unfold. Morning light filtered through the blinds of my apartment, casting slatted shadows across the rumpled sheets where I'd tossed through the night, her parting words echoing like the rain's fading patter. I rose, the cool hardwood grounding my bare feet, and moved to the mirror, studying the woman reflected there. Not the fractured strategist of yesterday, but someone transformed, her eyes holding a subtle clarity that softened the sharp edges of perpetual vigilance. The professional self I'd armored so rigorously now felt lighter, less a prison and more a vessel reshaped by the vulnerability I'd allowed to surface. No longer did I see only the poise as salvation, but as a temporary scaffold, one that could yield to authenticity without collapsing entirely. The ache lingered, but it hummed with possibility now, a quiet assurance that the boardroom's demands need not eclipse the deeper currents I'd glimpsed in her office. The harbor's gray expanse outside my window, mirroring a sea, no longer so turbulent within. Coffee brewed, steam curling like unspoken thoughts. As I settled at my desk, the laptop's glow pulling me back to revisions on the merger pitch, the decimal error now corrected, slides streamlined with a precision that felt less frantic, more intentional. Her email arrived mid-sip, the subject line simple: refinements and next steps. But the body carried layers, her contralto voice almost audible in the typed words. The oversight was a pivot point. Let's refine it together. Meet me after hours. Private guidance, away from the corridor's eyes. No overt command, but the hint threaded through, promising continued navigation of the fractures we'd mapped. Her amber gaze implied in the phrasing that blurred professional counsel with something warmer, more veiled. My fingers hovered over the reply, pulse quickening at the invitation's subtlety, the slow burn pull drawing me toward entanglement without haste. Her reserve a mirror to my own, ensuring the connection deepened in measured steps. Internal resolutions settled as I typed my acceptance. The cost of composure weighed against the promise of connection unfolding like a balance sheet finally in equilibrium. The isolation of unbroken poise, once a necessary toll, now paled against the sanctuary her presence offered. A space where desires could simmer without immediate exposure. Vulnerabilities shared in coded exchanges that fortified rather than frayed. I'd paid dearly for the armor, burying longings under layers of calculation. But in her orbit, the scales tipped. The terror of surrender felt less like risk and more like reclamation, the ache transforming into a profound recognition that true strength lay not in invincibility, but in the courage to let cracks admit light. Her email closed with a single line, looking forward to unveiling more, sultry in its restraint, affirming the fire she'd named, stirring anticipation without demanding immediacy. The words a gentle probe that eased the perpetual tension I'd carried alone. Future implications bloomed in the quiet of my apartment, a slow burn anticipation of deeper entanglement weaving through my thoughts. The late-night meetings that might evolve from strategy sessions into confessions. Her hand's warmth on my shoulder, echoing as a harbinger of touches yet to come. Proximity in elevators or rain-slicked garages, building toward revelations we'd both guarded too long. No rush, but the magnetic draw promised layers peeling back gradually. Identities concealed at work, surfacing in private sanctuaries. The power dynamic shifting from barrier to bridge. Her guidance a veil for the mutual longing that hummed beneath. I imagined her office at dusk, rain streaking the windows again, our breaths sinking in charged silences. The firm's cage feeling less confining with her as confidant. The slow unraveling, a path toward authenticity I'd never charted alone. The emotional payoff crested, then. A realization of power in our shared, unspoken longing. The quiet force of recognition that bound us without words. Her vulnerabilities glimpsed in confessions of loss, mirroring my own, turning isolation into alliance, the ache into a shared pulse that empowered rather than diminished. In that mutual guardedness, strength emerged, not in overt declarations, but in the indelible charge of glances held too long, touches that lingered just enough to affirm without overstepping. It was a power born of restraint, profound in its subtlety, promising a connection that reshaped not just careers, but the very essence of who we might become, entwined yet unhurried. The day faded into routine, but now infused with that indelible charge. Corridors no longer echoing isolation, but possibility. My desk, a waypoint toward evening's private guidance. The harbor's waves, a rhythmic underscore to the slow burn igniting within. Across the boardroom, our gazes met briefly. The walls between us thinner now, charged with unspoken promise. If this slow burn resonates, subscribe for more tales of veiled desires.